Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be recommending some of the best coming-of-age novels that I've read. As always, I've tried to select for my recommendations video novels that fit all of the categories that I mostly read, so be prepared to find some classics, some horror, some gothic, and some fantasy novels on this list. Before we get started, I have a brief channel update. So some of you might have noticed that I didn't do my regular upload last week, and that is because recently I've been thinking about how to change things up on the channel a bit, and so last week I was just sketching new ideas for new videos. Based off of some of the comments I've received from you guys, I've decided to do fewer review videos and to focus instead on doing analyses of books rather than reviews. I also wanted to focus on analysis rather than reviews because I actually find the analysis videos tend to be more interesting for me to make, and I can really get into a text and get to grips with it, which I think makes for better content than just giving it a general review. Now, obviously, doing analysis takes more time than just doing a book review, so it may be the case that my upload schedule will change a little bit, but I am going to try from now on to stick still to the one video per week, and if that changes over time, then I will let you know in another update. I do plan to intersperse the analysis videos with videos like this, so list videos as they're a bit easier to make, and I still think interesting and informative. And I also plan to do more general discussion videos on literature as well, so be on the lookout for those. The final two things that I'm considering also doing on this channel are analyses of poetry and maybe even song lyrics. So if either of these two things are things that you would like to see, let me know and I will definitely consider doing that somewhere in the future. Right, with all that nonsense out of the way, let's get into the list. So first on the list we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, published in 1847. It was actually this novel that gave me the idea for doing this video, and I wanted to kick off with Jane Eyre because I've recently just read it, and I think it's one of the quintessential coming-of-age novels. Jane Eyre is a coming-of-age novel that focuses on the titular character as she struggles to assert her identity and sense of self in a world with various oppressive forces. What makes Jane Eyre such a great novel is not only that it was a revolutionary book in its time, with its creation of a very intimate first-person narration style, and its focus on the maturity of a young woman as opposed to a young man. It also just has a fantastic, strong, female protagonist in Jane Eyre. Right from the beginning we see Jane as someone who, even though she is flawed to some extent, she has a very strong sense of herself and who she is, and she never lets that strong sense of self fade in view of the forces that try and oppress her. What I like most about Jane Eyre as a protagonist is that she manages to be a strong female character without falling into a Mary Sue kind of archetype. Yes, she is strong, yes, she is powerful, but she also has nuance, she also has depth, and we see her throughout the novel slowly growing and changing until we get to the final form of Jane at the end of the book. So overall, if any of you want a classic novel that focuses on the coming-of-age story of a young woman, then I couldn't recommend Jane Eyre enough. Okay, next on the list we have Angela Carter's The Magic Toy Shop, published in 1967. The Magic Toy Shop is another novel that also kind of inspired me to make this video, as it is the novel that I'm currently working on an analysis video of. I also want to mention this after Jane Eyre, because I see the Magic Toy Shop as somewhat of a spiritual sister to Jane Eyre. Both of them focus on the maturity of a young woman, both of them have gothic, sometimes magical realist elements to them, and both characters face patriarchal forms of oppression that they must overcome through the course of the story. If there is one big difference though between Carter and Bronte's novel, it is that for Carter she's really focusing not just on the usual kind of growing up style of maturity, but she's also focusing on the sexual maturity of the protagonist, Melanie. This isn't something we really get all that much in Bronte because, it's a Victorian novel and you don't really tend to get them talking about sex very much. One of the big themes in a lot of Carter's work, and something that I think she does really well in all of her work, is capturing the sexual side of human beings and the sexual relations between men and women in their relationships with each other. The Magic Toy Shop explores these themes through Melanie as someone who is coming into understanding her sexuality and her place as a sexual being, and we see this not just in terms of how she relates to the men around her as she's growing up, but also how she relates to her own body as it's changing. So if you're looking for a coming-of-age novel that focuses more on sexual maturity, then I would recommend The Magic Toy Shop, because I think it's a great book, it does a great job of capturing those themes, and it's Angela Carter, and if any of you have been around on my channel for a while, I do talk about her a lot. She's just one of my all-time favourite writers. Okay, next on the list we have The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain, published in 1876. This novel, for me at least, is a bit different from the previous two on this list, in that it seemed to me that Jane Eyre and The Magic Toy Shop have a certain realism about them. Even though they do have somewhat fantastical moments, the coming of age and the depiction of childhood, to me at least, is very realistic. Whereas The Adventures of Tom Sawyer doesn't really do that. Instead, I think it's a much more sentimental coming of age story. When I read this book, I got the sense not that I was reading a realistic depiction of childhood, but instead I was reading the work of someone who, being an old man, or old, fully grown adult at least, he's reflecting back on his childhood, and so there's all this nostalgia and this, backwards rose-tinted spectacle stuff going on. And so what you get is a very sentimental depiction of childhood. It's really romantic, it's really beautiful and wistful, and not really realistic. It's definitely a novel where an old person is looking back on childhood and kind of valorizing it, rather than a realistic depiction of childhood. That being said, it's still a very good depiction, it's still a wonderful novel, but it's definitely different from the more realist approach that Carter and Bronte took. One thing though that I do think the book captured really well comes at the end of the book, and this is when the central friendship between Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer starts to break apart. We see Tom Sawyer slowly becoming more socialized and, edging slowly towards that progression into a mature young man and wanting to be part of society. And we see Huck Finn resisting that and still wanting to, be the boy in the woods just having fun and not really maturing. And this was the bit of the novel for me that really made it stand out to me and why I think I ended up putting it on this list. I think Mark Twain does a really good job of capturing how fleeting those childhood friendships are, and how, the minute you enter a new stage of life, whether it's your early teens or your late teens, you just become a different person, and people who you thought would be your friends forever as a kid, you just drift apart. And that part of the book I thought was really well done, and less sentimental, and so I really enjoyed it. Also, I always like a good friendship in a book, and the friendship between Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn is just one of those classic, perfect friendships. Next up, we have Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, published in 1962. So, just as I said that I thought The Magic Toy Shop was somewhat of a spiritual sister to Jane Eyre, I also see Something Wicked This Way Comes as a spiritual brother to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. Again, there are just similar themes and dynamics going on. In this case, we have, again, a plot centered around two friends that are on the brink of growing up together and their relationship with one another. Only in this case, the setting is much more realistic, even though it has a backdrop of fantasy. At least the friendship seems to me more realist than it does in Tom Sawyer. And it's a lot darker than The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which is much more a pleasant, kind of pastoral book. Something Wicked This Way Comes might actually be my favourite book on this list. I think that friendship between Will Holloway and Jim Nightshade is just one of those quintessential, perfect friendships. It's not overly sentimental, they get on with each other, you can see why they would be friends, but you also see why they're different people, and why they might eventually drift apart from one another. Bradbury does a really good job of showing you not only where these characters are at the moment when we read of them in the books, but by having little parts that deal with their family life, we can also see where they're going to go in the future, and that leads to a real poignancy at the end of the book. Another reason why I put this book on this list is that it's not just the coming of age or maturity, if you like, of these two boys, it's also somewhat of a coming of age story or a maturity story for Will Holloway's dad, Charles. Now Charles in the book is a much older father. I think he must be in his late, I don't know if you would get an age, but I think he's basically late middle-aged man with a much younger wife and therefore a very young son. And he hasn't really come to terms with the fact that he's older and can't do things, and he feels this disconnect between himself and his family because of this. And just as much as the story is about these two boys growing up and accepting, the changes in their bodies, in their lives as they mature, we get the same sort of thing with Charles Holloway, and it just adds another layer to the story, which I think is fantastic. And also the dark fantasy setting does a really good job of bringing these themes really, up front and center. This is definitely a book I'd recommend to anyone who's interested in fantasy, or at least light fantasy, and definitely horror readers, I think, will enjoy this one. Now moving to a straight-up fantasy novel with A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, published in 1968. So I have actually covered this book on my channel as a review, and I will probably do an analysis, because I think this is one of those books that really, you could really get into some great themes with this one. But in that review I mentioned that what I love about this book is that it has the epic world building and all that kind of stuff that classic fantasy has, but all of this plays second fiddle to a very intimate coming-of-age story plot with Jed, the main character. What I also like is that this world and this magic system is infused with that coming-of-age story and reflects it metaphorically and actually in the world to just have this very symbiotic relationship with the themes of the book, the world of the book, and the characters in the book, and it's just everything ties together so perfectly, and that's why I think it's such a good coming-of-age story. The magic system in Earthsea is such that every action that you take, any magical action that you take, will have a positive but also a negative effect, and it's the job of the wizards to maintain the balance between these positive and negative forces. Now, Jed is someone who is as a powerful wizard, thinks he can just do whatever, and because his intentions are good, there won't be any bad side effects, and in the course of the novel he learns that this isn't the case, and ultimately he has to learn to respect that balance, and to recognise that even if he thinks he's a good person, he's going to do terrible things, he has a dark side, and he has to embrace that. I think it's just one of those archetypal, great stories, and if you like classic fantasy, and you like a fantasy story where the magic system and the world and the themes of the plot and the characters all coalesce together, then I think you will really enjoy this one. Okay, next on the list we have a book that I haven't read in a long time, but it's definitely one that I could not put on this list, and that is Peter Pan by James Matthew Barrie, published in 1911. So this is definitely a story that I think everyone who is watching this video will probably have heard of, although you may know it through the Disney animated film rather than the book itself. But I think the book is definitely worth checking out, and even though I do actually also love that Peter Pan film, better than the film too. I always found that in the book, the Peter Pan that we get is much darker and conflicted than the version we get in the film. Although in the film there are moments where Peter Pan, has tantrums and, you kind of do detect those sides to his character, the book definitely brings that out more. There is something tragic almost about Peter Pan staying as a child and not growing up, even if there's also some wonderful magical elements to it as well. Again, it's a long time since I read this one, but I do remember just really enjoying and appreciating that dark underbelly to Peter's character, which I just didn't think was there that much in the film. I also think, to compare it to Tom Sawyer, both of these books to me seem to be about escapism. Only in the case of Tom Sawyer, what we have is the author creating this childhood fantasy so that he can escape back to his kind of nostalgia and his melancholy about those things. Whereas in Peter Pan, we have a similar sort of thing, there's this nostalgia for childhood, but the writer isn't under any delusions about that. That's why he creates this fantasy world called Neverland, rather than trying to set it in a realistic setting, which is what we get with Tom Sawyer. So I think, even though both of these two books are good, if you like that kind of whimsical nostalgia, then I think that probably Peter Pan is a little bit better because it doesn't kind of delude itself into thinking it's telling a real story. It's set in a fantasy world, it knows that being a child forever, it just isn't, feasible, you can't do it. Okay, just two more books to go, and both of these last two are going to be classics. First up, we have Morris by E.M. Forster, which was written all the way back in 1913, but not actually published until after Forster's death in 1971. The novel tells the story of Morris, a young gay man, as he has to come to terms with his sexuality and also find his place in a world that rejects homosexual love. This for me is probably my personal favourite of Forster's novels, even if it's not necessarily, aesthetically or objectively, as much as these things can get objective, his best. But I do think, just for personal reasons, it's a great book. What I like most about Morris is that it presents a gay protagonist who is flawed and basically just a regular person who discovers this part about themselves and has to just deal with it. He has to find a way to make peace with it, internally, and also find a way to exist in or outside of society. We also see him face other struggles as well that most of us might go through. He has struggles with religion, struggles with society in general, not just to do with his sexuality, and all these kinds of things. What the novel doesn't do, which I always hate in a lot of gay novels, is it doesn't sensationalize the sexuality of the person. It's just a feature of their personality that they have to deal with. It's not some kind of big thing that they're making a sensation about. It's also not a tragic book, which is another, common trope with gay novels is, one of them dies or something terrible happens. We don't get any of that, and I really appreciate it for that. It's nice just to find that there's a classic novel that is positive about gay relationships and tells a personal, moving story of that kind. I also wouldn't just recommend this to young gay men. I would recommend it to anyone who feels like they are, they have an identity, or not even an identity thing, but they're into a subculture or whatever. Anyone who feels like they've been an outsider or feels like they're being made to conform to society, I think would enjoy and appreciate this book. It's a great book, and it's definitely unique among the books on this list. Okay, now we're on to the last book on this list, and it is one that I am definitely well overdue for a reread of, and that is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which was published in 1850. So David Copperfield is a little bit like Jane Eyre in that we don't just follow the protagonist from their childhood to their kind of end of teenage years. We actually follow them for much longer than that. And in the case of David Copperfield, we follow David all the way from his infancy to being a middle-aged man. Now, David Copperfield is a very complex character and is constantly, throughout the novel, undergoing changes and shifts in his personality as he goes through life and has to grow and change as life goes by. Now, I do have a personal soft spot for the earlier parts of the novel which do focus on his childhood, especially the parts that deal with his relationship with his mother, who loves him very much, but unfortunately she marries a horrible man named Mr. Murdstone, who is basically with her for financial reasons, and we watch as that relationship is broken apart by this cruel, tyrannical man. Now, what I like about this early part of the novel is not only just that general part and the plot there, but the fact that Mr. Murdstone, after David leaves home and he begins to make something of it himself, we don't see much of Mr. Murdstone again. He does appear every now and then, but he's more of a presence in David's mind for a lot of his life, and he finds it very hard to get over that abuse and that oppression and the kind of doubts and the things that would happen to you if you suffered that kind of abuse so young. And I think this is one of the best parts of the book, is David coming to terms with that, and eventually, at the end of the novel, being able to somewhat make peace with Mr. Murdstone. Not in the sense of becoming his best friend, but no longer is this man a terrible, oppressive force on his life. Now, there are many other parts to this book. There's so much character development and so many ways in which David matures throughout the course of the novel, but I just wanted to talk about that particular one because I think it's a particularly interesting one, and one that if you do read it, you'll get to grips with quite early because it happens at the beginning of the book. But yeah, this is a fantastic and, to me, perfect coming-of-age story, and is also why I chose to end the list with this book, because I think it's just perfect. Okay, that's it for my list of coming-of-age novels. Please let me know in the comments what are some of your favourite coming-of-age stories, and a slightly related topic, what are the novels that helped you when you were growing up and, coming into yourself? What are the kind of books that you meant something to you and that helps you grow and change in that period? I'd love to discuss all of that in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel for new videos. I upload videos, fingers crossed I upload new videos, every Monday, 4 PM UK time. If not every Monday, then fortnightly. We'll see how things go with the new direction of the channel. But for now, that's it for me, so take care everyone, and I will see you all in the next video.